Have you ever made a promise you really truly meant to keep? What if that promise involved thousands of dollars for not doing something? We're about to dive into the true story of a simple family promise that went all the way to New York's highest court and ended up changing contract law as we know it.
You know, it all really comes down to this one fascinating question. If I promise to pay you a bunch of money, not for doing something, but for giving up something you have every legal right to do, is that a real, enforceable deal? Or is it just a nice gesture with no real legal teeth?
Okay, so let's meet the players. Our story centers on two guys, an uncle and his nephew. And yep, they were both named William. The uncle, he's the one making the offer, so in legal terms, he's the promiser. The nephew is on the receiving end, which makes him the promisee. And the promise itself? Well, it was anything but ordinary. This was the deal Uncle William laid out. He told his nephew, look, if you can stay away from drinking alcohol, smoking tobacco, and gambling, playing cards for money, shooting billiards, all the typical vices for a young man at the time, and you do it until you turn 21, I will give you $5,000.
Now, we have to put that number in perspective. We're talking about the late 1800s here. $5,000 was an astronomical amount of money back then. This was life-changing cash. Think of it like winning a small lottery today. This was a really, really big deal.
So the terms were set, and the path to that money wasn't about doing something extra. It was all about not doing these three specific things. He basically had to give up stuff that, legally, he was perfectly allowed to do. And you know what? He did it! For years, young William stuck to his end of the bargain completely. The day he turned 21, he wrote a letter to his uncle and said, I did it. I fulfilled the conditions. The money was his, fair and square. But here's where the story takes a turn. So the promise is made way back in 1875. 6 years later, in 1881, the nephew makes good on his side of the deal. The uncle even writes back, says he'll hold onto the money with interest for him. But then, tragically, before he ever actually hands over the cash, the uncle dies in 1887. And this is where a family promise explodes into a full-blown legal battle. The person put in charge of the uncle's estate, the executor, took one look at this deal and said, absolutely not, we are not paying this. He basically argued it wasn't a real contract, so the estate didn't owe the nephew a single dime. So, you've got these two clashing arguments. The executor's side was saying, hey, the uncle got nothing out of this deal. The nephew not smoking didn't make the uncle any richer. It was just the promise of a gift, not a binding contract. But the nephew's argument was powerful. He said, hold on a second, I gave up my legal rights for years. That was a detriment to me, and that was my side of the bargain.
This whole case really forced the courts to get back to basics and ask a huge question. What's the secret ingredient? Where do you draw the line between a casual promise and a contract that can actually be enforced by law?
It turns out there's a specific legal term for what the nephew did. It's called forbearance. It literally means refraining from doing something that you have a legal right to do. So this wasn't just about being a good kid. From a legal standpoint, he was actively giving up his freedoms.
And that brings us to the absolute core of contract law, a concept called consideration. For any deal to be a real contract, there has to be an exchange of value. Both sides have to get something or give something up. That something of value is the consideration. It can be cash, an action, or, as we're seeing here, the act of giving something up.
So, this was it. The entire case, once it reached the highest court in New York, boiled down to this one question. Did the nephew's forbearance, his act of not drinking, smoking, or gambling, actually count as valid consideration? Was giving up those freedoms valuable enough to make his uncle's promise stick?
And the court's answer was a massive, resounding yes. This quote from the decision is just so clear. The court basically said, it doesn't matter if the person making the promise got some obvious benefit. What matters is that the other person, the promisee, gave something up. In this case, he forbore his legal rights.
So the verdict was in, and it was a huge win for the nephew. The court made it official. Giving up his legal freedoms was absolutely sufficient value to make the contract legit. The deal was solid. He got his $5,000 plus all the interest that had built up.
This case gives us a perfect way to think about it. A promise to just give a gift, that's a one-way street. Value only flows in one direction. That's not a contract. But a real contract has to be a two-way street. Value has to be exchanged, moving in both directions, even if that value is just giving something up. So why are we still talking about some family squabble from 1891? Because its impact is enormous. This case, Hamer v. Sidway, established for good that giving up a legal right counts as consideration. It proved that you don't need to show a clear benefit on one side. Just showing a detriment, giving something up, on the other side is enough. And that idea shapes how we think about contracts every single day.
And that kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Think about the agreements and promises in your own life. At work, with your family, your friends. Which of those are just one-way streets, more like gifts? And which ones are truly two-way streets, where both of you are giving up something of value to make the deal work? The answer might just surprise you.